So we're delighted to be joined now by David Thomas, the CEO of Barratt Redrow, one of the biggest house builders in the country. David, thank you so much for joining us. The reason we wanted to talk to you is because you've just put out with Lichfields this fascinating study into car parks and how they could be used and turned into literally, I think, hundreds of thousands of homes. So could you start by sketching out for us what the opportunity is here?
Yeah, first of all, I mean, I really appreciate the opportunity to come along and talk to you today. So, look, just in terms of car parks, I mean, I'd first of all set it in the context that Barratt Redrow have undertaken the redevelopment of car parks on a number of occasions. So, for example, with Sainsbury's, for example, with Tesco's, where we're undertaking large-scale redevelopments, and in some cases, putting the car park entirely underground, and in some cases just building on car parking space that is not required. So this got us thinking about other car parking opportunities, and we undertook quite a big study on a car park in a south coast town. So as you know, a lot of south coast towns will be high residential values, acute shortage of space, certainly with views of the sea and so on, and very often very large surface level car parks. So again, we looked into the viability of the redevelopment of that, really on a test case to understand it and for that to be presented to the local authority. So this inspired us to work with Lichfields, and Lichfields undertook a study of all the car parks in England. And think broadly car parks will split into two categories, those in public ownership and those in private ownership. What we are probably particularly focused on is car parks that are in public ownership and also surface level car parking. So our estimate of that was that if you looked at all the car parking, taking around 20% of the available car parks that we felt were suitable for development, that could create up to 700,000 new homes. So a really big opportunity. And we felt that the sort of build model would typically be apartments. So leaving car parking space under the apartment building. So we're not necessarily losing the car parking space, firstly, because that clearly can be an amenity to the town or amenity to the train station and such like. And then building above that, we saw that big opportunity in terms of green walls, so something that was really fitting in with the local environment. And then the other big opportunity is to have lots of solar panels on the roof. So we think there's a whole package there where you could be providing affordable housing, housing for key workers, housing that will really fit into that local community. And it needs to be a national program. It's not a program for Barratt Redrow. So we are really pushing this in terms of, I suppose, just the thoughts around it. We're happy to pay for the research, pay for the thoughts about build methodology. And we've really tried to talk to government about it to make sure that everyone is clear about the scale of the opportunity. When we have a situation that we're trying to build a large amount of housing, if we take 1.5 million homes over 5 years, to know that there's 700,000 homes that could come from a relatively small area of car parks, I mean, that's a big opportunity.
I'd be really interested because I happen to work in Belgium and the Netherlands for a number of years. And it's fascinating to see the contrast because in a city like Ghent, for example, it's a very closed, kind of narrow, congested city. It's a very old city. It has similar problems to a lot of towns on the south coast, like you mentioned. So sort of old streets, very limited surface area to put car parks and things. And so just the very natural sort of Dutch Belgian approach is to do sort of cut and cover car parks or car parks underneath other stuff, other buildings or so on, and build up from that. I'm just sort of curious in the research, was there, because we often talk on this show about learning from other countries and what they're doing. Was there any sort of inspiration from other countries in the research that you were doing, or really focused on the UK?
I think Lichfields were primarily focused on the UK because to some extent for them, it was an analysis exercise in terms of looking at car parks and car park availability, car park utilisation and so on. But I would certainly say, in terms of looking at the broader topic of car parks, I mean, I think there's inspiration from the US market as well. You look at something like shopping centers. So, shopping centers in the US, shopping malls, converting car parks to residential use is something that is very much happening in that marketplace. In the UK, I think when you look at large shopping centre owners or large supermarket owners, I think they very much recognise that the area above surface level car parking is presently dead space. And it's space that clearly has a value. Now, I'm not saying you could build above every car park, and I know that there will be plenty of examples where you wouldn't be able to build, but I would say the vast majority of car parks you could build above. And we've seen over the years that different types of assets will become available for development. I won't run through them all, but Barratt Redrow has been in business since 1958, and an example would be bakeries. That bakeries saw a big period of consolidation, and there was lots of bakery sites that came up as opportunities for development. So we see car parks as something that has been there for a very long time, and the development potential just has not really been fully recognised, fully realised.
Is the other advantage of car parks that they're, I guess, relatively straightforward as these things go from a planning perspective, in that, they're brownfield. It's not like you're having to make the argument about why we should build on, something that's a bit nicer than a car park. And also that you're dealing with a relatively small number of stakeholders. You're dealing with Sainsbury's, who own hundreds of car parks, or Tesco, who have hundreds of car parks. And also, I guess, the government could conceivably, I don't know, pass some sort of rule or something about car parks specifically, which could unlock all of this housing in a relatively straightforward way, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, and again, I think in most cases, and I know there'll always be exceptions, we looked at a car park near an area of special scientific interest. So, I mean, that clearly would just be a no-no. So I think the reality is we're looking at predominantly surface level car parking in urban areas. There's also already a big impetus from National Rail or from TfL in London to look at how do they better utilise the, not necessarily only car parking, but the areas around train stations. So these are areas that, I know definitions change, but I think that they would classically fall into a sort of grey belt, brownfield type definition. And I think it should be relatively easy to get appropriate planning. Now, I understand that if you're I'm always reluctant to name individual towns or individual local authorities for the risk of upsetting somebody. But I think you can understand that if you're in Tunbridge Wells, you're not going to build 15 stories above a car park. But that isn't the point. I think even if you're able to realise 2 or 3 stories above the car park, there is a huge value add for the community in terms of something that would be typically focused on more affordable housing.
Yeah, it's interesting that you mentioned the TfL example, because we talked recently about the history of the Metropolitan line and the sort of creation of the London suburbs like Harrow and out towards Uxbridge, that kind of direction. And effectively, they were created from similar approaches to unlocking land. One of I guess the things with car parks specifically is if you look at how you deal with local communities and potentially local opposition to development, traffic is often a little bit of a lightning rod for objections and things. So have you thought much about how you would sort of manage that or communicate that in terms of, you're taking away our car parks, or you're going to make them unavailable for a period of time, or is this going to cause traffic problems, that kind of stuff?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, availability and utilization of the car parking spaces is key. So we've been through that sort of, let's say, slightly formulaic approach with the supermarkets, because they will literally place an economic value on every car parking space. So the reality is, yes, of course, allowing utilization of the car parks is very important. But also, when you look at car park capacity compared to car park use, there is a lot of surplus space, not just on saying the car park's busy Monday to Friday, but empty Saturday, Sunday, but car parks that are just never busy. I mean, I live in Croydon, and I've seen that in Croydon, where the local authority have just closed part of the car park redeveloped part of the car park, resurfaced and renewed the remaining car park, everyone's happy. There's no loss of amenity. So I think it's got to be on a case-by-case basis, but the ongoing utilisation is important. And the ability to put in place, for example, mezzanine parking with temporary steel structures whilst you complete the build still allows you to maintain almost full capacity in terms of car parks.
Oh, fascinating. So you can essentially build a temporary car park over the top, I guess, of the sort of foundation work, preparatory work, and then pull that down once the ground level is back in place.
Correct. So to deliver the build on a stage-by-stage basis.
Huh.
So what I've found with people that I've talked to about car parks, and our team at Barratt Redrow are always amused about the amount I can talk about car parks. But what I find is that people come back to me maybe a month later and say, oh, actually, I've got a car park near me and I was looking at that car park and I think there's a real opportunity. So I want everyone to look at car parks and tell their MP what a good opportunity it is to redevelop the local car parks.
Car parks are a surprisingly regular source of a lot of conversation on our podcast for some reason. But David, I want to zoom out a little bit because, you know, you're the CEO of Barratt Redrow. You're a volume house builder. If we're going to tackle the housing crisis and build all the homes that we need, there's companies like yours that are going to have to be building a lot of the homes. So I was just wondering, can you talk to us about what it's like from your perspective when you're considering a new development, like say there's like a whole new build development, how do you evaluate a piece of land for the opportunity? And what are the sort of key steps from getting to there to getting the keys in the hands of new owners? And what are the biggest sort of challenges and stumbling blocks, I guess?
Well, I think first of all, for a house builder, when you step back, I mean, I've worked in a number of different sectors, so department stores, hotels, video games, and so on. And so I think the one thing when you're house building is that in the UK, you know that within reason, there is always going to be demand for new homes. So it's not so much about where can we build and where can we operate? Will there be sufficient demand? It's much more about the availability of land. And what, again, I think is unusual in house building is that most businesses have some form of raw material that they're either buying in to sell or they're manufacturing to sell. And for us, we buy in all of our raw materials, bricks, blocks, windows. And if we want 150 million bricks, we can buy 150 million bricks. The challenge with land is that land comes in all shapes and sizes. So we'll see land being brought to us, or our land teams will identify land, possibly as small as 50 homes that could be built on the land. And the largest site that we have within our portfolio is around 6,000 homes. So land comes in all shapes and sizes, and therefore, from our point of view, looking at the viability of those sites and what we should pay for the land and the speed with which we can develop the land is really the key thing. It's almost unheard of for somebody to come to us with a piece of land and us say, no, we don't think the demand is there. But it is common for us to say, no, we can't meet price expectations because we don't think the viability is there.
So this is a really fascinating topic. We've talked about it a bit on the podcast before. I'm sure you're familiar with the sort of suggestions that you get from people of, you know, our developers are land banking and they're pushing up the prices of houses, all of this kind of stuff. But essentially, land is part of your supply chain. You have to try and maintain an adequate supply of it. Otherwise, your whole kind of production line effectively is grinding to a halt, and that's going to cause problems. So I guess you're constantly trying to strike a balance between you don't, I assume, want lots of land sitting around, not earning back revenue and being able to develop on. But at the same time, you've got to keep some kind of breadth of supply available so that you don't grind to a halt, right?
Yes, yeah, absolutely. And so what I think most businesses would call stock, really, that, you know, we get land banks, because I think it's maybe makes it sound a bit more controversial, but you know, stock. So I mean, if you talk to a petrol company, you know, petrol companies have huge stocks of diesel and petrol because they have extended supply chains and they need to hold stocks. Land position, I think, that to just explain two aspects of it. One is that if we were going to develop near a town, we feel that the town is going to expand over time. you would then look at, well, where do you think the town is going to expand over the next 5 years or 10 years? And we might take a view that the town will expand to the north because we feel that the transport links around the north are the best links and that would encourage development. But somebody else may take a view that it will expand to the south. So people in house building will look at options over land to be able to bring that land forward for planning. And that strategic land, we will have examples where we've held interests in land for more than 20 years before we get planning. So the reality is that that comes into the land that we hold, but we can't possibly develop that land presently. And then the other part of it is that what we would say is the operational land bank. If we have a site that has 500 homes on it or could have 500 homes on it, I think that the people who want to be critical would say, well, you can build all 500 homes in 12 months. But you just can't. I mean, you can't do it physically because you can't just build everything at the same time. You have to put in roads and sewers and infrastructure and move through the site on a gradual basis, because if you put everything all at once, it would never be viable. It's not unique to the UK, but we are an at-risk model in terms of private housing. So if you want to buy a house from us, you don't enter into a contract with us to pay us as it goes. What you do is you pay a relatively small reservation fee, and then at some point you will be exchanged for 5 or 10% of the selling price. But we're out of pocket for 100% of the land and 100% of the build cost before we get fully paid. So we couldn't possibly build all 500 homes just on a cash flow basis, and we couldn't build them on a practical basis because the local authority have to sign off the roads and the sewers, and that all costs money and that all takes time. So we would say that on a 500 home site, then we would expect to go through that probably over a 4 or 5 year period. So what we would do is we would brand it, maybe Barratt at one end, David Wilson or Redrow at the other end. So we feel really strong consumer brands that are offering a different type of housing and will create demand locally. And then all of our developments will be subject to an affordable housing requirement. Across the UK, typically around about 20% of the homes on average will be affordable housing. And therefore 100 of the 500 we will build on a more accelerated basis, because then we do get paid as we go rather than being paid when we complete. So that's kind of how the model works. I mean, I think in most businesses, if somebody said to you, it doesn't matter what you're selling, if somebody said you can sell everything tomorrow, I would say most chief executives would say, fantastic, I'll sell everything tomorrow. If somebody said, look, let's hoard things and see if they go up in value, I think most chief executives would say that's a very bad idea. And that is not a business strategy. That's just guesswork and speculation.
So you mentioned there affordable housing as one of the factors that go into the model. How do regulations like affordable criteria and so on affect your decision making and the viability of a site? We talked on the show a few weeks ago about how concerns around there being rare snails was holding up the planning permission of one site in Sussex and so on. And developers typically face, is it nutrient neutrality rules and things like that? These all must factor into your thinking. Is there any particular regulations which really sort of move the needle for you in a disproportionate way in terms of this site is viable versus this site is unviable?
Yeah, okay. So again, in any business, house building is no different. The biggest challenge for any business is uncertainty. So if somebody says, look, in location A, you've got to provide this amount of affordable housing, maybe you've got to provide a water filtration system, you've got to meet 10% biodiversity net gain, and so on, fine. We absolutely understand the rules, and it's clear that we can decide whether the site is viable or not viable based on the rules. Where it is clearly much more difficult if rules change over a relatively short period of time, or if there is real uncertainty about whether the rules can be satisfied. So for us, if you look at affordable housing, as long as local authorities are clear about their affordable housing requirement, the house builders will very quickly understand whether that is viable or not viable. I think we've seen this play out in London, and there was announcements made yesterday about the affordable housing requirements. The reality is that we only build houses. So we want it to be viable because we want to get on and build and sell houses. So if affordable housing requirements are too high, the reality is it will not be viable. It doesn't matter what part of the country you're in. If you're in the north of England and say affordable housing requirements are typically 10 or 15%, because there is better affordability and there is more affordable housing stock per head of population than, say, in London. But if that changed from 10 or 15 to 25 or 30, the vast majority of developments will become unviable. And then the other example on uncertainty would be, if you look at nutrient neutrality, I think that, I mean, I have really been involved in this over a long period of time, because it started off as an issue in Southampton, and we have a division in Southampton. And so our Southampton division were saying it's really difficult to buy land because there's issues to do with nutrient neutrality. And you, okay, well, just explain that to me. And it's then grown and grown. And the last count I had, I think it was 74 or 75 local authorities that were impacted by nutrient neutrality. The government have been desperately trying to unlock this to allow these authorities to develop with more certainty, but we don't have a fully unlocked solution at this point in time. Now, I recognise not just on nutrient neutrality, not just on affordability, but as a national house builder, we're big in England, Scotland and Wales. I think we're probably the largest private house builder in each of those marketplaces, is that we're spreading across the whole country. But if you're a local builder, a small builder, or a regional builder, well, if you're a smaller regional builder in Southampton, you've obviously had a really, really tough time over the last few years. So it can become very polarized in terms of where this uncertainty exists. So I think give any market, any business certainty, and they will work out quickly what they are and aren't able to do.
On sort of a related topic, but you mentioned earlier a little bit about when you're looking around a particular town and you're thinking about which direction is it going to grow in the future. Obviously, in recent years, we've introduced local plans in various local authorities. I think it was Lichfield. I'll double check before we go to air, but I think they had a report which actually looked into the impact of local plans on things like planning permission and found that actually in a lot of cases they seem to be slowing down the process or seem to be actually introducing more issues there. I'm curious if you've got any perspective on how you've found that working with local authorities, like when a plan is in place. Does it help? Does it not help?
Well, I would say a plan in place will definitely help, because there is just more certainty about where the local authority are expecting housing delivery to take place. Where I think the problem arises, which I know, sounds quite obvious, but nonetheless, I think where the problem arises is where the local authority deem that development should take place in certain areas, but there are constraints which result in costs arising that make the development unviable. So, for example, there could be very significant remediation. Just to illustrate the point, that the local authority may decide that redevelopment should take place in an area of land where perhaps it's been an area of landfill, and there's inner landfill, so development can take place there, but there's a requirement to clear, remediate, and pile foundations. Well, the reality is that, yes, it's a good bit of land to develop and it's close to transport links, but the viability relating to it is simply not there. So if a plan is, let's say, comprehensive, then the plan will work very well. If the plan is not comprehensive, what will happen is that when sites come forward, they'll be considered to be unviable for one reason or another, and then the local authority will need to go back to the drawing board. The only other point I would flag in terms of the local plans is just the amount of time taken to get the local plans together. And I think that, there's plenty of examples of local plans that will have run into years in terms of actually bringing those plans together. Again, I'm always reluctant to name local authorities, But, the government have called out local authorities historically, both the Conservative government and the Labour government, in terms of the amount of time it's taken to get plans in place.
So one thing I'd love to ask you about on a related note is what can be done next. So at the moment, we talk on the show all the time about the Planning and Infrastructure Bill, which is currently working its way through Parliament. That's going to hopefully speed up building things and put structures in place to incentivise building and so on. But from your perspective, is there anything else that you'd like to see the government do? If you're on the phone to Steve Reed or Rachel Reeves or Keir Starmer, what could they do to help you get things building?
Well, first of all, we've said many times over the last 15 months or so that we're hugely positive in terms of the planning and infrastructure bill. And, and I think the ambition of government, we see, and previous governments have talked about a housing crisis. And there is no question that the UK has a housing crisis. If you look at the UK relative to other European countries, I think you can pretty quickly get to that point. And also, if you look at affordability, particularly for first-time buyers, I think you can get to that point. So we hugely welcome anything that will bring more supply into the market. I think the government and probably everyone around the industry has been surprised at how long it has taken, but we're very hopeful that the bill will become law in November, and then we can start to move from there.
Do you think the 1.5 million target is achievable? I mean, we talk about it. I hope they can do it. It seems like a very nice target to have, but do you think it can actually happen?
I look, I'm very, very enthusiastic about the government setting a target at 1.5 million. And to be frank, I would much rather the government set an ambitious target for housing. And I think everyone recognises it is an ambitious target. I think it's slightly ironic that the Conservative Party had a target of 300,000 homes per annum, and they didn't get held out as much on that target as the Labour Party saying 1.5 million over 5 years. I don't really see that as being the issue. I see it as about the extent of the conviction that government have. If you look at our industry, we haven't built 250,000 homes per annum since the early 70s. We don't have a supply chain to build 300,000 homes per annum. Fact, we will have to import materials from Europe, which we've done historically, bricks, blocks, and so on. But if the supply chain believes that the government is committed, then the supply chain will start looking at expanding factories, opening factories, and the like. We've said that we want to grow our business by 30% over the next 3 or 4 years. So we're absolutely behind it. I mean, we don't do anything other than build houses, so we're 100% behind it. And for me, it's a much, much better position than the government saying, well, let's build 1 million homes. Let's just trundle along at 200,000 homes per annum. We've seen, I've been here now 16 years, and the highest has been 245 and the lowest has been 125. So there's been a huge amount of volatility in the market, and we still haven't reached the amount of housing that we need. So I think also the government's focus in terms of a better balance between private and affordable is very, very important. As a country, we spend an enormous amount of money putting people who are on the affordable housing waiting list into private housing because there isn't any affordable housing available to be utilised. So local authorities are paying rent for private housing. So we have to also ensure that we are increasing affordable housing. And going back to my car parks, that is probably the single best opportunity for the country to deliver more affordable housing in an acceptable way from everyone's point of view. In terms of ask, I was told when I became chief executive, I met very early on with Secretary of State, and the Secretary of State said to me, "Look, the problem with business is that business just comes to government and asks for things. They ask for support, they ask for stimulus, they ask for their problems to be sorted." And I think we've been very, very careful not to ask. I think we've been very careful to point out where there are opportunities and where there are challenges. And ultimately, government have to make their own decisions about how they intervene. So I think we would like to see us as trying to work in partnership, trying to inform, but ultimately different governments and different ministers will make different decisions. We said that demand-side stimulus is good for first-time buyers. Of course, demand-side stimulus is good for first-time buyers. I mean, I was a first-time buyer in the 1980s, and I benefited from the MIRA scheme, which was a huge government stimulus scheme in the 1980s. But I think we've also got to recognise that we have to help ourselves. You know, in conjunction with Persimmon, we launched our shared equity product a couple of weeks ago. So we can't just go to government and say, can you do this and can you do that? They are doing a huge amount for the supply side. And I think under this government, it will play out as we become very, very different in terms of our approach to development. What I think I've found particularly impressive is the attitude and the desire for the government to get involved in everything, you know, whether it's data centres or residential or reservoirs or the Lower Thames crossing, all these things where they've realised, look, we're just locking up the country because we can't get stuff through planning. Now, I understand some stuff will never get planning because it's just not appropriate. But for us not to be giving planning for reservoirs, you think, okay, that's a pretty basic level that you would assume is appropriate. And likewise, something like the Lower Thames crossing, which I had explained to me about a week after the election, that somebody was explaining to the Chancellor about the Lower Thames crossing. And I saw it was approved about 3 months ago, but they'd spent, I think it was 1.2 billion pre-planning. So these kind of things, you know, I think the government can do a huge amount of good for the country by unlocking the planning system more effectively.
Fantastic. That's a great place to leave it, I think. Like, the government haven't taken on my suggestion of a nuclear reactor in every market town, but there's still time yet. But David Thomas, we're going to let you get back to the important business of actually building homes, which is very important. So for now, David Thomas, thank you very much.